am Valerie Wilson, Director of EPI's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, as well as your moderator for the next hour. 2020 vision is a term used to describe visual acuity. 2020 vision is often referred to as perfect vision. And coincidentally, this year, the year 2020, which is also an election year, has brought systemic racism and economic inequality into sharp focus as demonstrators across the country refuse to let their demands for racial justice and accountability for those in power go unanswered. More than 150 years ago, during the period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, attempts were made to redress the evils of slavery and its legacy of social, political, and economic disenfranchisement. Today, we continue to face many of these challenges in our society. And so again, the year 2020 is a time that we bring into sharp focus systemic racism in all of the ways that it shows up in this country and really begin to think seriously about how we once and for all redress many of the things that were set in place hundreds of years ago in this country. I'm joined today by our guests, the distinguished panel of speakers, Richard Rothstein, who is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and author of the book Color of Law. We're joined also by Heather McGhee, who is co-chair of Community Change, and Natasha Reed-Rice. I'm sorry, Color of Change for Heather McGhee is her affiliation. And we're joined by Natasha Reed-Rice, who's Associate General Counsel for Real Estate and Finance for Habitat for Humanity International Incorporated. I want to welcome each of our speakers and panelists for today. The way that we're going to proceed with this, we're going to open by hearing from Richard and some of the findings of his research in the Color of Law that lays out how we got to the place where we are now with extremely segregated cities across this country. And we will continue from Richard's presentation by hearing from Heather and Natasha and discussing some of the remedies. We know how we got here, and so we should know, or at least have a good sense of what it will take to move forward and get beyond the place where we are now. With that, I am going to turn things over to Richard to speak for, I believe it's about 5 minutes, 10 minutes maybe, from the Color of Law.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie. The theme of the Color of Law is that the widespread myth that we have that residential segregation just sort of happened by accident. We call it de facto segregation because it was created by private bigotry, landowners and real estate agents not willing to sell to African Americans or rent to them in white neighborhoods, or maybe the actions of private actors like banks and real estate agents, or maybe because people like to live with each other of the same race, or maybe just income differences. All of these individual private actions created the residential segregation that we know today in every metropolitan area of this country. And we think that if it happened by accident, it's too bad, de facto segregation, but there's nothing we can really do about it. It has to unhappen by accident. What my book shows is that this is an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it. Of course, there was private bigotry, but it was federal, state, and local policy, explicitly racial, that created the segregation that we know today. Private bigotry would not have been able to flourish and impose segregation if the federal government in particular wasn't requiring it to do so. I give an example of the book of the Levittown, east of New York City, probably the most well-known of the subdivisions that were created in the mid-20th century by the federal government. 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to build, to buy the land and to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. The only way that Levitt could get the money to build that development was by going to the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, getting them to guarantee his bank loans, a federal guarantee, and the federal government required, as a condition of this guarantee, that he pledged never to sell a home to an African American, even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. Levitt was a bigot. Left to his own devices, he would have segregated Levittown on his own, but he wasn't left to his own devices. If the federal government had said, we'll only guarantee your bank loans if you promise and pledge to sell non-discriminatorily, he would have had to do so or abandon the project. So this was a federal imposition. It's an unconstitutional segregation. And this was duplicated in every metropolitan area in the country. The creation of all white suburbs for working class whites by the federal government. It's an unconstitutional violation of the Fifth Amendment on the part of the federal government to do this. It requires a constitutional remedy. We're obligated as Americans to remedy civil rights violations. And this is not simply something that can unhappen by accident. It's going to require federal policies and state and local policies and private actions that are as powerful in creating non-segregation as it was in creating segregation.
All right, thank you, Richard. We will continue now. I will turn things over to Natasha Reed-Rice to share her recommendations, including any follow-up discussion you have from Richard's remarks, as well as discussing your specific area of focus in centering the needs of community and some of the similarities between the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and what you're seeing as a community organizer.
All right, well, thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Richard, for the continuing work you are doing in ensuring that we are all very aware of the history that has led to many of the moments we're experiencing today. I think in the midst of the pandemic, we're starting to now see what the true pre-existing conditions are in the communities across our country. We often have heard of the pre-existing conditions being discussed as health related, but when we really begin to look at our country, many of those pre-existing conditions are soul related. When we look at how we treat and determine who we treat as human beings with decency, with dignity, and that really does extend to homes and what we consider homes. All of these stay-at-home orders call to the forefront the concept of home in this country and the issue of housing, right? Many, as Richard so well has articulated here, but also so well documents in his book, The Color of Law, that the situation that we're in today is not by accident. It was very intentionally done at the federal level and the state level. And now when we look at the affordable housing crisis and the housing affordability issue throughout our country, we realize that it's just an extension of these legislated, policy-oriented situations that were obviously done for economic gain, but also done in a context of a very segregated, racist, and in many instances, dehumanizing scheme. So now within the work that I'm doing at Habitat, as many people know, is very focused on home ownership, realizing that home ownership is essential to the growth of community, but also it's essential to the growth of wealth. I mean, some of the other things that Richard points out in his book is that the segregation that was mandated at the federal and state level has been a very instrumental part in the income inequality between the races in our country, where African-American income is 60% of white income. It is also an instrumental part in the creation of the wealth gap in this country. When we look writ large, especially pre-COVID, and these numbers may actually obviously be impacted now as a result of the pandemic, African-American wealth is valued at just 10% of white wealth in this country. Those disparities have extensions and tentacles to the lack of access to credit in the middle of the 20th century, lack of access to affordable housing options. When you look at the value of housing and how it has continue to exponentially rise, and the wealth building and the wealth options that it has given to white families versus those to African American families, we realize that all of that was done in such a way that it has continued to create disparity between Black families and white families and other families of color throughout this country. So at Habitat, we focus on home ownership, but now with our cost of home advocacy campaign, we're focusing on the whole ecosystem of housing, and realizing that in this country, more than 19 million people have to pay more than 50% of their income for housing costs. That means that they're having to make choices between paying for food, healthy food options for their children, access to adequate healthcare for their children. All of these essentials to survival are on the table because they've had to spend so much for just housing their families. And so when we say stay-at-home orders, my hope is that it will call to the forefront of the minds of many of us who are listening today, but also to those who can be influential in making public policy choices and changes in this country, to realize that not every family has that option. And in the wealthiest country in the world, this should not be a choice. This should be a right that families have to affordable, decent housing to grow and to thrive. So I look forward to a continued conversation on this topic.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm going to open things up for Heather now to share any recommendations or reflections that she may have on what either of the previous two speakers have said, but also discuss some of the ideas and themes coming out of your new book, Prospering Together.
Is that a baby? Hello. Oh, what a thrilling interruption. Hi. So for that beautiful child's future and for all of ours, I want to thank Richard Rothstein for his book, Color of Law, which really did, I think, for many of us who have worked on these issues of economic opportunity and racial equity our whole careers, put into one highly readable volume exactly how we've been lied to in small lies and big lies about exactly how we came to be so segregated. And you really can't read the book without having a paradigm shift of understanding about the role that the federal government played in segregating America, and therefore the responsibility that the federal government now has, not individual families, neighborhoods, and communities, white, Black, and everything in between, but rather the government now has the responsibility to make it possible for us to have a truly integrated multiracial democracy in America. So thank you to Richard, and thank you as always to my friends at EPI and to you, Valerie, for your leadership. It's a real pleasure to be with you, Natasha. So I want to start from sort of the intervention that Richard's book made on the public discourse to those geeks, almost 1,000 of whom appear to be on this call right now, who are really interested in these issues, to now the hundreds of thousands of people who are buying Richard's book, as it's now on the bestseller list, in this moment of mass consciousness raising and uprising around the movement for Black lives and Black liberation. We do need a paradigm shift in thinking and a leveling up of understanding among white people, obviously, who are still very much overrepresented among the decision makers in our society, but also all Americans as to how we got here. And that's why the first recommendation I want to put on the table is something that is not a discrete policy recommendation, but I think is a necessary precursor to the public and political will to create the kind of policies that we need. Because when we have a false diagnosis of the problem, as Richard said, when we think about, when we do the sort of American story of how economic opportunity is created, and we think about individual choices and individual hard work, when we lie to ourselves about how getting married and getting a college degree and working hard is going to give you the American dream, when we know that Black families who do all three of those things still have far less wealth than white families who do none of those things, we really actually set ourselves up to have a very contested fight about what we do next. And so I think it's really important for everyone to support a real effort to get particularly our political leadership, but also in ways that communities can be involved, get the country on the same page so that we can then turn it. And all other societies that have had this kind of large-scale trauma as ours have had some sort of process where they're not still contesting the basic facts of what happened. And I think it's really important. And actually my mother, who's someone who Richard knows very well, has been the architect of an idea to create a Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission in America. And it's already happening in 14 communities and on over 24 college campuses. 2 weeks ago, Barbara Lee introduced a resolution, it's Congressional Resolution 100, she has dozens of co-sponsors, to have that kind of commission writ large. And what's great about that is it allows community members to tell the racial story of their neighborhoods. And that's where efforts like what Richard's book spurred, the idea that, suburban homeowners are finding the racial covenants in the homes that they have bought, right? It's where you start to realize exactly where the demarcation line of redlining is. And of course, it's that block that you always knew made the shift between the haves and the have-nots. That kind of local community-based sort of unearthing of our true racial story, I think is so important, because less than 10% of American high school seniors even knew in 2018, when the Southern Poverty Law Center report came out, that the Civil War was fought to defend slavery. I mean, we have a level of literacy about our country's basic creation, tenets, and propagation of racial inequality that I think as long as we still have that level of misunderstanding, of miseducation, of deliberate miseducation and misinformation, it's going to be very hard for us to do what we need to do, which is put aside the illusion that we can have years of racially neutral policy layered onto an edifice of racist targeted policy and come out with equal opportunity. So obviously we need a whole regime of racially targeted policies that I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation, but I just want to put out there the idea that first we have to get on the same page before we can turn it. And a process like that, which hopefully will be required reading for Richard's book, will include a required reading for Richard's book, could get us there.
Thank you. Building on what you were mentioning in terms of the disinformation, miseducation of U.S. history as it relates to race, I want to pose a question for each of you to respond to. And that is, why does it seem much easier for us to draw attention to and to build discussion around some of the more visible manifestations of white privilege? We can talk about the examples of police murdering Black people in the streets, discriminatory housing. We've seen a lot in the news lately about people demanding that Confederate symbols, monuments, statues be torn down. There's a lot of focus on those things that are very visual, very visible, and I cite the invention of cell phone cameras and putting a lot of that stuff front and center. When you see a video of somebody being killed in the street, it's hard to say that it didn't happen or that it wasn't racially motivated. But why does it seem so much more difficult for Americans to make the connection between underlying economic deprivation and racism? Why is it so much easier to think about some of these very visible or physical ways that racism manifests than it is to understand how the supremacy of wealth and deciding who has and who has not is also directly linked to this history of racism in this country? So whoever wants to respond to that first. Natasha, I saw your screen light up there.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to. I mean, I think that's a great question. I will say we've had videos before George Floyd and people did not necessarily react or tune in. I think we're in a very unique moment, and I've called it a sacred nexus in terms of COVID has shut down all other distractions. So you can't get distracted by football games. You can't get distracted by Broadway theater. You can watch it on Disney Plus, but you can't get distracted by you know, right? So now all eyes are on what we're watching, and you can't really run away from it in the way in which people have been able to turn from it in the past. So I think that there's something about that unique moment that is kind of causing all eyes to tune in. It's kind of like when Roots came out, that the reason the viewership was so high is there were only 3 stations, ABC, CBS, NBC, right? So, I mean, I think the topic is obviously compelling, but I think it's also the timing of when it happens. To your larger question about the economic component, you know, I was at Ebenezer for the last 11 years and as an associate pastor, very much ingrained and involved in the King theology of social justice. Too many of us look at King in a very kind of, for lack of a better term, whitewashed context. We love him now, but they didn't love him then. And especially at the time when he was assassinated, because that was when he really began pushing for economic justice. So this issue of economic justice has never been an easy topic for folks in our country to swallow. His push for the rights of garbage workers, really at that time, he was a hated man, not a loved man. His focus of the civil rights movement, when they began to get in the issue of housing, it was stopped. His failure in Chicago, which was really focused on the issue of housing to a large extent, did not succeed. So this issue of housing, of economic justice, has been a challenging aspect of this conversation of racism in this country. I mean, the complex system of slavery was an economic system, right? So when we're talking about how we dismantle something in that way, and I love, Heather, what you said about how we try to do these, we try to have a race neutral, and Richard, you've alluded to this in your book and said it quite explicitly in other contexts, a race neutral solution to an explicitly racist system does not work. And so we have to be very courageous in this moment where now I do believe the will is shifting. We do have the attention of folks to move forward. The taking down of Confederate statues, personally, I believe is necessary. It's part of the truth and reconciliation moment that I think we are seeing the need for and have had the need for some time. But that's a one and done, right? This issue of housing requires a concerted, longer term process that involves and intersects with so many other aspects of our economy. So those are my initial thoughts on it. I say also the other last thing before I move off to someone else to speak is the issue of housing is a very personal one. Who you bring into your home, who you have around your neighborhood and your kids. If that you have lived in a society that has dehumanized and othered people of color and Black people, it becomes very difficult to begin to see them as part of your neighborhood. I really think we need a movement of neighboring again. The idea of who your neighbor is and how do we determine and define our neighbor? For those who come from a faith-based perspective, I often say, you know, you were never told to love your religion, but you were commanded to love your neighbor. And how are we doing that today?
If I may chime in here. Valerie? Yeah, Heather referred to the fact that we've been lied to. Let me describe for a minute what we can do about that. You know, I'm very encouraged about these the demonstrations, the Black Lives Matter movement that's taken over the country really in many ways, but it needs to move beyond police reform, which is absolutely essential, and the removal of symbols, into local civil rights groups that can emerge out of these demonstrations of people who are willing to do some hard work, as civil rights groups did in the 20th century. Heather mentioned, like I say, that we've been lied to. Well, the curriculum of every high school is misleading young people about how segregation occurred, why the conditions for the murder of George Floyd were created. Although it takes local activists meeting together, working together, going to their local school boards, going to the superintendents, insisting that the curriculum of their schools be changed so that people understand something about how it happened and what we can do about it. If the young people don't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. There are alternative curricula developed. The Zinn Education Project, something that I've been working with, has developed some alternative curricula. The Southern Poverty Law Center has alternative curricula. In the Color of Law book, I analyzed the most commonly used American history textbooks in schools today. They all lie about this history. They all promote the notion of de facto segregation, completely scrub from the history the role of the federal government in creating the segregation. But it takes local groups meeting with local school officials and then creating pressure to change the curriculum. There are other things that local civil rights groups can do as well, long before we're at the point of changing national policy. I mentioned before the communities all across the country, like Levittown, that were created by the federal government, but they also took the participation at the federal government's behest of banks, of real estate agencies that helped to create this segregated environment. They all exist locally today. Local civil rights groups should be mobilizing to propose and then pressure local institutions like banks and real estate agencies whose successors still exist today to create funds to remedy the segregation that they've created, to provide subsidies, as Natasha said, race-conscious subsidies to African Americans so they can purchase homes that are now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable to their parents and grandparents had they been permitted to own them in the 20th century. That's another form of direct action. In the last week, there was a widely reported study issued by the law school at Suffolk University in Boston that documented how 80% of renters in the city of Boston experienced racial discrimination when they tried to rent apartments. Another study by Long Island Newsday last year documented how real estate agents continue to discriminate against African Americans when they seek to buy homes that they can afford, but are not permitted to access because they're steered away from them. Well, the beauty of that Long Island Newsday study was that because New York doesn't require mutual consent for videoing interactions, the testers in that Long Island Newsday study actually wore hidden cameras and showed, and the Long Island Newsday website, you can watch the videos of these real estate agents discriminating. Well, there should be pressure created by local civil rights groups, simply demonstrating in the streets for police reform, which is very important. It's not going to do this. There needs to be pressure from local civil rights groups to get state departments that license real estate agents to lift the licenses of real estate agents who practice this kind of discrimination. Well, I can go on and on. There are dozens and dozens of actions that local groups can take to begin the remedy of residential segregation. But it requires first of all, biracial groups. They have to be led by African Americans because whites cannot be telling African Americans how they should live their lives. But they also have to be led by whites because African Americans alone don't have the political power to make these kinds of changes. So we need biracial local civil rights groups that can begin to have specific local targets to remedy segregation. And with that kind of activity, it can slowly build to that kind of national movement that can, as in the 1960s, created the pressure for national change to minimize segregation.
Heather, would you like to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone to lots of good places, and there are also really good questions in the Q&A, but I'll just say on the why, you know, I do think that it's both a mental framework that is very much sort of the dominant white American story that is very individualized, that is very invested in innocence and you know, really rejects any sense of culpability. I'm not saying this is what like individual white people think about themselves, but I'm saying sort of the dominant American story is that, you know, America is above all good. And the moments in which we have not been good, we've taken care of those. And in fact, we really need to fundamentally flip our understanding of racism as something that bad people do to other people, right? To something that is the fundamental organizing structure of the American economy. And when you look at the hierarchy of human value upon which our country was founded as an excuse to to build a nation on stolen land and stolen labor, you see the signs of that still all across our racialized capitalist system. When you can have someone earning $7.25 an hour for their work, how much progress is that from $0 an hour from their work, especially when their colleague who's sitting in the C-suite of that company could be making $10,000 an hour? There's just this belief that there are people that are inherently better than others, and it falls along lines of race, anti-Blackness, but it also creates this whole ladder of value that, you know, tens of millions of Americans are sort of stuck on the bottom rungs of. And that's why in my book that I'm finalizing now and is available for pre-order now, called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, I look at the hidden costs of racism that we haven't yet tallied, that are the cost of racism to our entire economic system, to the way that we shortchange investment in ourselves and our communities and our children, our neighborhoods and our infrastructure. I think that it's the social science research shows that that has been a highly racialized process, from being a country that when the beneficiaries of public investments were exclusively white, was a very generous, you know, sort of social welfare state, from the Homestead Act to the GI Bill, and on into the subsidization and creation of the suburbs. These were all incredibly liberal, generous, free money, right? Free stuff, right? To create a white middle class, and that the elite will to continue to do that stopped when the people at the table became more diverse. And we see that also in the private sector labor market, where we had, you know, by no means through employer benevolence, but we did have a social contract at work where, you know, 1 in 3 households was under a labor contract at a high point before the unions really opened up, you know, universally to workers of color. And the attack on labor has been very racialized, and we are left now in a place where so few workers have decent benefits and pay, and that affects us all. So I think it's really important for us to shift the paradigm from thinking about only about the sort of individual story of how we succeed in America to one that recognizes the role of public policy. And I also think we need to get away fundamentally from this zero-sum notion of group competition. The idea that, you know, progress for people of color or for women is coming directly at the expense of white people and men. And I'll say something controversial that's really at the heart of my book, which is that I think that zero-sum paradigm of racial competition is actually nurtured unwittingly when we racial justice advocates only talk about the advantages of racism to white people, and talk about white privilege as sort of, you know, the defining story of what racism is, as it's sort of this little benefit for white people, as opposed to it's this structure that corrodes collective decision-making, corrodes everything that we share in common, that really is actually impacting us all. Because, you know, the sort of necessary follow-on to that logic is the logic of Trumpism. It's the logic of there has to be a race war because I'm not going to give an inch. I don't want to do any of the things that Richard just laid out if it's going to come at the direct expense of my family. And so we have to get out of that sense. There are reams of research about how integration is a net positive for all involved. And we have to recognize that we simply can't go on this way. It's costing us too much to remain this divided. And there are benefits to a truly equitable society for us all.
So building on this idea of actions that can be taken, because, you know, when folks come to webinars like this, they always want to hear, well, what can I do? What should I be pressuring my elected officials to do? So I want to ask, are there any particular pieces of legislation or proposals that you all find particularly promising, either things that have been introduced at some point in Congress, things that may be happening at the local level? Natasha, for example, things you may have seen in Georgia or Atlanta, the city of Atlanta in particular, or even things that may have come up during this campaign season that you all think are policies that we really need to put some weight behind.
Well, sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I think unfortunately what we're seeing in many local areas is the loss of funding for housing right now in this moment. I mean, we're seeing in multiple metropolitan areas, the loss of bonds that were set aside for the development of affordable housing. I think, and encourage those who are joining in on the call today to pay particular attention to some of the relief funding that is now being considered and contemplated in some of our federal pieces of legislation, and how perhaps within those pieces of legislation, we can continue to push for, policies that will increase the areas of land use and development, making land costs more affordable. One of the things that we often see in the development of affordable housing is it's often done on land that is the most affordable. Well, most affordable land tends to fall in areas that are already considered or in kind of a low income area with low resources and low communities of opportunity. And what happens then is then you begin to ghettoize affordable housing, right? I mean, which goes completely against what came out of the Obama administration with the affirmatively furthering fair housing. There's a lot to how we think about the placement of housing. So we've got to look at the costs of land. We've also got to look at areas and issues of access to credit. We need to look at underwriting standards again and think of what reforms need to happen when determining the credit score of folks that are trying to access credit. How are we going to continue to undo the legacy of redlining and how it has so impacted many of the communities that are in great need? So I think Richard has already listed several of the things that can happen at a local level that folks who are not necessarily involved in public policy making can get involved in. But those of you who have influence of your state house representatives and your state senators, as well as those who begin to really want to dive in and influence those at the federal level, begin looking at these policies and how they're being structured and what their intent and income are. I do want to say before I lose the mic, I really love what Heather just talked about in terms of the sum of the toll that we are all paying and the burden that we're all paying as a result of racism. And also what Richard talked about, both Richard and Heather talked about how housing was subsidized for white families. Now today you hear the term reparation and everybody throws their hands up and walks away and says, there's no way that can happen. Well, if we begin to really look at what Heather is saying, and Heather, you've so well researched this area and talked about it so much, you said it so well and so casually, it's huge to realize how much white families were subsidized in the 1950s, the 1940s, the 1960s, right? So now when we begin talking about some form of subsidy for African-American families, God forbid you say the term reparations, it's not socialism, anything different than what just happened in the 1950s and the 1960s. I think expanding upon that conversation, perhaps also hearing from Richard and Heather on that more, would help our listeners understand that it is not un-American to help your citizens actually live a valuable and thriving life.
Really well said, Natasha. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I was going to say, Natasha's absolutely right. The federal government subsidized white-only families to move from the working class to the middle class by supporting single-family home ownership in all white communities. And many people talk about this as being white privilege. I reject that term for much of this. The federal government should be subsidizing housing for all Americans. It should be an economic right. When working class whites and blacks came back from World War II as veterans and had jobs like my uncle, for example, working in a grocery store, and were subsidized to buy a home in Levittown. That was a right. That wasn't a privilege. That was a right that everybody should have had. And our focus should be not on white privilege, but on the denial of this fundamental economic right to African Americans and restoring that right so that we have a system of equality. Of course, there are very privileged people in this country. We've recently been reading about these rich people who are buying the way into colleges for their children by phony SAT scores and phony athletic records and that kind of thing. Those are privileged people. But working class people who were given the right to a home in the mid-20th century were not privileged. They were exercising a right that everyone should have had. And the crime is that African Americans were denied that right. And that's where our focus should be.
Mm.
Heather, did you have a response there
Okay.
that you're looking to say? Yeah. I would just weigh in on that a bit. I understand that framing of it, and I would just say that I agree that those are rights that everyone should have had access to and should have access to today. I think it does, however, become a privilege when everyone does not have that right. And so I think that becomes the challenge that we face. The fact that it is not available to everyone generates a privilege to those who do have access to it. I want to turn now, because it's several points in our discussion today, the idea of having racially targeted or racially focused policies or programs has come up. And so we have a question here from one of our viewers today, talking about the backlash against affirmative action and its race conscious focus in hiring and in higher education. So the question is, how do you all suggest that we prepare to overcome that kind of backlash? So if the solution is that we need to have race conscious remedies for housing segregation and housing discrimination, we can predict that there will be maybe backlash to those kinds of policies similar to what we saw with affirmative action. Do you think that's something that should be taken in consideration on the front end in terms of how we structure those remedies? Or do you say we rush ahead because we need to have race conscious policies and we address the backlash to that as we go along? So thoughts on that? How do we make race conscious policy stick and work?
Well, we can't rush ahead without the political power to enact these policies. But that doesn't mean that we need to persuade everybody in advance. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, that I keep on harking back to, did not have majority support in order to make the maintenance of segregation in public accommodations and in transportation and employment uncomfortable for the country. And likewise, we don't need to have majority support. We need to have an active civil rights movement, people who are activists and doing more than just demonstrating, but doing the hard work of organizing local civil rights groups that are going to make proposals and then take the hard steps of pressing for them to redress segregation. I think part of it is understanding the history, because affirmative action is hard to understand, hard to defend in the current legal environment if it's not based on a remedy for specific constitutional violations.
Right.
And so if we think that the segregation of this country happened accidentally or naturally, it's hard to justify affirmative action to remedy it. If we understand that it was unconstitutionally created, then it logically follows under our constitutional system that we have a constitutional obligation to remedy it. And so we need affirmative action policies in housing, because the housing segregation was created as a civil rights violation. And Americans can understand, not everybody, not perhaps an overwhelming majority, but many Americans can understand that if you have a civil rights violation, you have an obligation to remedy it. It's harder to understand that if you have inequality that just happened to grow naturally, that we have an obligation to remedy it. And so this understanding of government's role in unconstitutional policy is an essential foundation for a new civil rights movement.
And Valerie, if I could, Richard, can you explain what you mean by a constitutional violation? When
when the federal government, for example, guaranteed bank loans for developers that were creating segregated developments at the government's insistence, that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment.
Right.
When local governments, local police forces, organized in many cases mobs to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods, that was a 14th Amendment violation. When local governments created zoning rules that were designed to exclude African Americans from neighborhoods, that was a 14th Amendment violation. When the federal highway system was designed to explicitly, on a racial basis, to demolish African-American neighborhoods in urban areas that policymakers thought were too close to downtown neighborhoods, and to push African-Americans farther away from central cities into new segregated neighborhoods, low-income segregated neighborhoods. That was a joint policy of local planners and the federal government. That was a Fifth Amendment and a 14th Amendment violation.
Right.
So we need to understand that these are civil rights violations. They didn't just happen accidentally. And if we understand that they're civil rights violations, as I said, Americans can understand that that requires a remedy.
Yeah, thank you for that and clarification. That is really important. And thank you, Natasha, for raising that question. We have one here that is specific to Heather. You mentioned the truth in racial healing. Someone wants to know if you could share a bit more about that, and how do people find out about that and how to become involved?
Great, happy to. So it started with the Kellogg Foundation as a private nonprofit effort. And so people can go to healourcommunities.org and learn about it. There were about 150 organizations and leaders that came together that said, okay, we're not going to wait for, the country to do this. What would it look like for communities to do this? What would a handbook or a guidebook be that would give communities a framework to really do these kinds of truth commissions? And just one note, the reason why it's not called a reconciliation is because reconciliation suggests that we sort of were together, we parted, and then need to come back. But our country was founded in separation and founded in that belief in a hierarchy of human values. So it's really about transforming our country. And so you can go to healourcommunities.org and find interesting stories of where this is happening already. And then I did put in the chat in one of the Q&As where people can find out about the congressional resolution, which is Congressional Resolution number 100.
All right, thank you. I want to raise a question now that is really current. We're all at home. That's why we're doing this thing remotely today via webinar as a result of COVID-19. This question asked, what are your thoughts on the reopening the economy narrative? It puts the focus on returning to work as the sole task of employees, ignoring that small business owners, governmental agencies, corporations, and consumers' actions drive the recalling of workers back to work. Do you think this current economic narrative is miscast? And if so, how can we refocus the conversation to one that better understands the needed support for workers, and in particular, workers of color, who we've learned are disproportionately represented in many of these frontline, quote unquote, essential occupations? Any of you have thoughts about what's going on currently related to COVID-19 and this idea of everyone needing to rush back to work in view of what we've clearly seen as spikes in cases? The virus is disproportionately impacting communities of color, both in terms of the economic impact as well as the health impacts.
Let me answer in a related way. I can't answer that directly. I'm not I can't estimate how to balance the health considerations with the economic considerations. That's above my pay grade. But there was just a question in the Q&A thing that I'm looking at that says, I'm not sure I understand the claim that there are not currently people organizing at the local level around housing. And that goes directly to the issue that you raised, Valerie. There is a lot of very, very important and good organizing around affordable housing, by which most of the affordable housing groups understand to mean the housing for low-income families. The reality is, though, that in this economy, the private sector is incapable of providing housing for working-class families, not just for the poor. And we need to expand the notion that we have of what is the need for affordable housing to go beyond those who are eligible for the subsidized programs, which only cover the very, very low income families. And many of those families are working families who shouldn't be low income. so that the income policies that I know you work on, Valerie, so importantly, and the housing policies are interrelated, inextricable. So long as people are earning a low minimum wage, even if they're working full time, they are not going to be able to afford housing in this market. And we can't solve that simply with housing policies. The private sector, as I say, is incapable of building housing for people who are earning half average median income, even though they're working full time at real jobs. And so we need to completely rethink how we interrelate economic policies with housing policies. I got into this issue of looking at housing because I was working for EPI as an education analyst. I knew nothing about housing, and I decided the biggest problem we had in public education was segregated schools. And I realized that segregated schools are segregated because they're located in a segregated neighborhood. So I began to look at that, and I eventually concluded that housing segregation was an educational policy. Well, the minimum wage is a housing policy, because if people are earning too little to be able to afford housing in the current private market, that's an economic problem that relates directly to affordable housing and to segregation. So we need to expand our vision of what affordable housing is, but also to understand that we can't solve it with housing policy alone. We need to solve it with economic policy as well, with more egalitarian economic policies, which not only includes raising the minimum wage far beyond what is currently anticipated, but even reforming our labor laws so that unions have an actual right, not just a theoretical right, to organize, to raise the level of workers, many of whom are working in industries that could be organized if it was now permitted effectively, and is not. So labor law reform is also a policy of housing and a policy of segregation. So all of these things are interrelated, and that's one of the things that you do, Valerie, so well at EPI, and we need to all broaden our focus on this.
Yeah, and when you put numbers around that, right? So if the federal low income wage is still at $7.25 an hour, and as of 2019, the average housing wage, which is the amount needed to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment, was approximately $23 an hour in wage. You'd have to work 127 hours a week to afford that. I mean, so you can't, at the minimum wage, you can't even afford a modest 2-bedroom home working a 40-hour week. So to Richard's point, it's interconnected and interrelated in some very significant ways. And then one other view to think about when we're looking at, even, people may be saying, well, I mean, that's why they're putting a halt on evictions, right, in the rental market. But when you think about many of our metropolitan areas, the landlords who are renting those units are small landlords. They're not necessarily these large scale landlords with deep pockets that run on inevitably. And many of them are of color. So if they can't evict, they're not receiving rental payments. I mean, this all becomes a part of the full ecosystem of an economy of a particular area. I mean, we've got to think in a much more comprehensive way of who's now going to support those smaller landlords who can't, who we're also saying don't evict those. And we don't want them tenants evicted. We want tenants protected, but we've got to protect those smaller landlords as well so that those tenants can be protected, right? So, I mean, it's not a one and done solution. And as we continue to think about this, the partisanization of this moment, I think we cannot overlook it, right? And so this push to push people back to schools and back to work has a very partisan slant to it that could continue to endanger the most vulnerable, right? And we're seeing the the politicization and partisanization of housing. Housing is not a partisan issue. It's an American issue in this country. It's a global issue elsewhere, right? So we've got to really shift the narrative of how we talk about housing and the need for housing affordability throughout this country. And to Richard's point, that means that you go above your traditional 60% AMI as the calculation of those who actually need some form of subsidy to live decently in this country.
Can I
And
just
let me
add?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, just a quick point on what Natasha just said. Yes, the 60% AMI is the requirement of the low-income housing tax credit program. But in fact, there's such a shortage of affordable housing for low-income families that most of those projects only take people at 30% of AMI. And we need subsidies for much higher income people than that. And in particular, we need income programs that will get them to the point where they don't need those subsidies.
Mhm.
So
I'm
just
sorry.
on no, it's fine. Before we lost that point, and we also have Section 8 for renters, which is totally underinvested. Someone asked in the chat about the Sanders Biden Unity Task Force sort of policy document. It's a big PDF that folks can Google. It does include actually things like fully, providing Section 8 vouchers for everybody who qualifies, which would be, a massive increase over today's system. Just to talk about the coronavirus, I am in a low-grade panic about what could happen to Black communities if we do not come out of this. We've taken the economic engine off the tracks, and I think we absolutely have to rebuild it while we have it off the tracks before we put it back on. I mean, we know what financial crises do to Black Americans, right? We saw what happened in the recovery of the financial crisis of 2008, which, my argument is we would not have had if it were not for racism, because of racist discriminatory lending that regulators, turned a blind eye to. But we lost 2 generations worth of Black wealth. We have the same home ownership levels that we have now that we did before housing discrimination was outlawed. And that was under a Black president. So I just have no patience for us to not be very zeroed in on what the threat level is in Black America, and in Brown America, and in immigrant communities, and in Native and Indigenous communities, particularly. There's reams of data. Color of Change, which I'm the co-chair of the board does, did a survey of Black and Brown small business owners who are absolutely being decimated, did not have the relationships with banks to be able to get those early tranches of funding, have had to close. Obviously we have a third of Americans missed their housing payments on July 1st, a third. The House passed more aid in the form of the HEROES Act 6 weeks ago now, and Mitch McConnell just gave the Senate, the rest of the summer off while America is still reeling and cases are still mounting. I mean, this is economic, political, public health malpractice. I do not think that we will recognize Black America, in 6 months, in 9 months, in a year, particularly given the way that this has just decimated public budgets, which right now need to be spending more than ever to keep our communities safe, to reopen our schools, to deal with public health care needs, to adapt to this new way of life. 20% of Black people work in the public sector. We are going to be in a state level recession after recession and austerity if we don't act. And there are many things we can do, right? I mean, we were able to find $3 trillion and tuck in another tax cut for the wealthy, in an election year with the CARES Act last spring. We can rebuild smarter. We can spend a lot of money at the federal level. Someone asked about modern monetary theory. You can go all the way there, or you can just say, let's keep doing what we need to do to keep our people alive and keep our people economically secure. We need to be giving folks ongoing supplemental payments, on a regular basis. One check, $1,200 check was not enough. Letting UI expire, letting states continue to sort of prey on their unemployed people. There are lots of states around the South and the Southwest that are just make it so difficult for people to collect unemployment. States, including Ohio, that are allowing employers to report their workers if they feel unsafe to come in. I mean, we just have this predatory capitalism right now. And I'm really, I want to just, sound the alarm at every possible turn about how much is needed. When you look at some of the plans that came out from Democratic leaders in this year, whether, was Warren's plan for Black America in the spring, which I remember talking to Richard about, and him saying, I can't believe has the audacity to be talking about this right now. Look how times have changed, and the public discourse has sped up. To what just came out with the Sanders-Biden task force, there are things in there that would actually help staunch the bleeding and would help us rebuild and would frankly save our communities. And we do need the political power, and we need to keep up the pressure. And we need to avoid austerity at all costs.
Well, we are at our time. I want to thank the three of you, Richard Rothstein, Natasha Reed-Rice, and Heather McGee, for joining us today. I think it was a very fruitful conversation.